discussion is what's very important.
So we're going to start. Since this is the last session, each of us on the panel are going to make a series of separate statements that are completely unchoreographed. So there is really no general theme for the last panel, more like a series of 6 or so, 7 parallel statements. And then the parallel processing will come from the audience, who will then, I think, start immediately. So we actually will just deliver our statements and then start talking with you for a while, and then we'll eat, right? So this is just a kind of movement from words coming out of the mouth and then food going in. So we just make that transition. I wasn't here on the first day, so I didn't hear the toxins argument. So, but nevertheless, I want to link the question of preservation to the question of toxicity, and I try to give you some clues as to how these two things might be linked. If you take the question of toxicity, of course it's all a question of concentration, and this is something that's been said before, but to take the most obvious example, water is completely toxic if you take it in the wrong dose or you put it in the wrong place. Very small amount in your blood and you're finished. Quite a lot you have to drink.
There's no toxicity at all. Sorry.
I'm going to argue this. I'm going to argue that anything in an overdose can be toxic. Anything, including a panel like this one.
Love can be toxic.
So that would be the first claim, build on the question of concentration anyway. And precisely not spoken from the point of expertise. Precisely not. Then, of course, in any situation, even why you would use the word situation is because situation is a word you use to describe the fact that there are a number of heterogeneous systems at work. That makes it a situation, right? So in any situation, there are many different systems, and obviously what could be considered toxic relative to one system would be the opposite relative to another. So that would be point number 2. Point number 3, the idea that you could, as it were, synchronize all the systems such that you could operate in a non-toxic way is impossible, and anyway completely uninteresting, because that would be the dream, in fact, of a single system. And seems to me the dream of a single system is responsible for almost all of the things that we refer to with the word horror. Then point number 4 would be a system. It's not just that relative to each system, by changing concentrations you can be toxic or not. You could argue that a system is in fact defined by its toxicity relative to other systems. Right? It's actually what makes a system, what gives a character to a system is actually this thing. And then the 6th point would be that within each system, an overdose is not just positive, but essential. And in fact, of course, each overdose changes the definition of what a dose is. So there is a kind of, within each system, an incredibly active negotiation that goes on. So in that sense, toxicity is a kind of preservation. It's all about preservation, right? So you cannot imagine survival without toxicity. And if toxicity is a question of concentration in this definition, then actually toxicity is a kind of life preserver. And so on. So of course it's all a matter of calibration. Now you can argue the reverse very, very simply. Preservation is for sure a matter of concentration. It's a matter of measure and a matter of quantity. It's never itself absolute. Indeed, you could argue that what preservationists do is to sort of adjust the concentration of images of time. And they're really sensitive to how many buildings are being preserved, in the most obvious case of a building. And they're adjusting, they're leaving in place a certain measure, a certain amount of images of what you think of as the past, which immediately raises the question, which is too big a question for tonight, but can the past be toxic? actually be really a threat? And the answer is for sure yes. And without the thought that the past is actually toxic, more dangerous than any dream about the future, preservation would also not operate. Or to put it another way, can you overdose on the past? The answer is yes. If you believe half of what I said to you before, overdosing on the past not necessarily a bad thing, might be even an essential thing, might be necessary, but it's seriously a question of overdose, which means there is a trauma, necessary trauma, let's say. The typical model within which we think about preservation is that we live in an age of an overdose of information. And this is the standard definition, that everybody is so bombarded with information, and the information is seen to be ephemeral, that the preservation is seen to be a corrective, even a kind of medication against this, by providing controlled doses of the past. Right? So the preservationists see themselves as sort of offering a kind of medical corrective to the overdoses of information, or you could even say an overdose of the present. So the past is seen as a kind of a corrective operation, and not just that, a regulated dose. And by regulated, I mean the law. Preservation always operates from the law, so it's a kind of requirement, a required dose of the past is needed. It's a kind of prescription, in a quite literal sense. Mm-hmm. It's a prescription. So the preservationist operates with this kind of quasi-medical sensibility that a certain dose of the past will act as a sort of a healing corrective gesture in the face of an unhealthy overdose of information and a loss of a sense of time that comes from that. Right? So that's the sort of standard scenario. It's a good word, Francois, scenario. The standard scenario is the scenario within which the preservationist is seen to be a virtuous figure, like the good doctor. And since my father is a doctor, it's actually more interesting for me the idea of the bad doctor, the inattentive doctor. So the question is, okay, if this is the case, if the preservationist is sort of offering a dose of the past, carefully controlled, regulated, with the force of law, always seem to be operating in an unhealthy environment, a polluted environment, in fact, which is why I think it's very, very interesting, Jorge's expertise in the question of cleaning, that somehow it's also kind of a cleansing thing. Dose of what? Like if you preserve a building, let's say, it's a dose of what in the end? And I want to make the very strong claim that architecture is a rearguard art, that it's actually always the last of the arts to think about a particular question, the very last. So it's not just a rearguard art, it's actually precisely the rearguard art. And precisely because it's a rearguard art, architecture is the single lowest technology field on the planet. You cannot name a discipline that's lower and slower. We are low and slow and philosophical, and we come at the end, right? But just because we're the rearguard, I mean, we can be 80, 100, 200 years late, and we still high-tech. For example, high-tech in architecture means large pieces of metal that look like they've put together like a children's set. And the word high-tech is used in architecture, and nobody laughs. Right? So you see this building with big nuts and bolts, and we say high-tech. So you have to understand that we operate in a completely different time zone than humans do. So because architecture is a rearguard art, in that sense you could say architecture is always a preservation act, because we always come late and we always preserve an image of something. We talk about the future and the present and all of that, but actually we operate very much with the past. So in a way, this kind of preservation involves constructing an image of a kind of unchanging past. So we actually constructed late side. This image can be a few years late, or it can be decades late, or centuries late, or even millennia late. Very typical time frame for architects is between 50 to 80 years. Modern architecture was promoted by its promoters as being finally in the 1920s architecture coming to terms with the consequences in the middle of the 19th century of steel and glass construction that were themselves the consequences of industrialization 100 years before. So actually the promoters of the radicality of modern architecture insisted that it was 160 years out of date. So if you think of that, so you think of then of architecture as kind of preservation, as the holding of an image, not at the beginning of a technological shift, but actually at the end, at the very end. So basically steel and glass gets monumentalized by architects exactly in the moment in which other technologies become available. So if architecture is a form of preservation, then preservation becomes interesting, right? Because preservation of architecture is the preservation of a preservation act. So it's a double act preservation. It's a really tricky thing. So what becomes possible is a kind of avant-garde use of this rear-guard role, which is... and so just a few last words. I tried to bring this back to the monastery. The rear guard, what's the rear guard? Well, the rear guard is in the rear, right? But what they do is they guard the rear also. That's crucial in the military, right? There's always this, you're the rear guard, and actually you're with the generals. And then there's the main guard, and then there's the avant-garde. And actually there's another one. There's another guard that's ahead of the scouts for the scouts. And there's a communication system links all of them. And for us, 160 years in front of us is the avant-garde, and we're back 160 years, but we have good communication with the front lines. What we do is we preserve the rear, which means actually what's really threatening is not what lies in front of the avant-garde, but what's just dying immediately behind you. And this is where preservation comes in. The primary purpose of preservation is not to hold the past in front of your eyes, but is actually to disguise the loss. So we're exactly the symmetrical opposite of the avant-garde, which is why, for example, in the 1920s, the words to describe the avant-garde in the arts, like shock, alienation, defamiliarization, were the opposite words to the words being used by the architects of the same moment. So basically, coming from this point of view, architecture itself operates by constructing a kind of stable image of something that's actually just gone. So it's always a kind of monument, always a kind of memorial act. And the fact that it's a memorial act is disguised by this language of modernity, new technology, new ages, new considerations, new ethical concerns, and so on. So we ignore the fact that actually what we are doing is just trying to put up a kind of block, a kind of mask of what is actually dying and has gone. So this would lead us all then in kind of a full circle that we normally think of the avant-garde as associated with life, right? And the preservationist with death. So the preservationist becomes a sort of mortician who doesn't let a building die, freezes it in time, takes it out of time, and actually stops the building from living in order to disavow death, right? In order to say that death didn't happen. So if you have this discourse in the avant-garde, which is all about life and energy and new sources of inspiration and new sources of energy and so on, a kind of steroid philosophy, then you have, so you have steroids at one end and you have embalming fluid at the other end. That's the normal understanding. But actually what's more radical is the rearguard action and the rearguard of the rearguard, the preserving of architecture. So when you hold a monastery like this one in view, when you, as it were, allow it to linger, there are many, many radical potentials opened up by that. And I think this is what's so interesting about preservation. So the reason I'm saying this, of course, is I think that the discussion of toxins is so important, and I think that the panel discussion this morning was so amazing. It would be kind of important to understand the toxicity of preservation itself, and in fact, it is traditionally giving you a very controlled dose of what you believe to be your past and constructs a nostalgia for a life you never had. which is really the way nostalgia operates. And it is the controlling of the dose that is what makes preservation, can make preservation flip from being a kind of anesthetic, which is a classical role of preservation, but a slight adjustment of the dose, and it can immediately flip to the most radical accelerant. And I think this would then be the way one could judge all the various decisions made about preserving a building like this one, which gestures are more in the anesthetic line and which gestures are more in the kind of more sort of hardcore, giving a bit of a shock to the system, even risking the health of the system. And I think, as I was saying earlier, these things are never entirely separate. In fact, any one preservation project, no matter how radically conservative it is, also, despite all of that, has this absolutely surreal capacity as well. Preservation is, in fact, totally strange. It's totally strange. It just doesn't use the language of estrangement. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of quiet weirdness to preservation, but there can be also this other mode. So I think the discussions which are coming out of the theorization and design for the kind of garden of toxins and so on also can be understood as a more general discussion of the whole project and its potential. So I think the idea would be now that this is a speech, right? There are going to be a series of these speeches, each of which will be disconnected from each other and therefore will cancel each other out. And that will therefore mean there's absolutely no effect on you. So you'll just sit, you'll have the sense that nothing happened. Yeah. So,
that was great.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll do that. It's my first time visiting here, so I'll mostly talk about my impressions and also what I see of potentials of this place, because I'm kind of practical in the sense that I like to have things being done, like to do stuff, to make things that can be implemented and have consequences on various levels. But what I was mostly interested in is the after hearing the project of Francois and Stephanie about talking about what the monastery used to be and what it was of a construction. And what I have focused most on is that I consider what the art has to offer to the society is that it's an experimentation platform that can create models, examples that can be seen as those, but it can also be implemented into structures where they can have a more confronting consequence and can be used directly. And I was mostly fascinated about the fact that a monastery for me is an experimentation platform. Most of all, back then, maybe most a secret experimentation platform. So a kind of intellectual property platform. They would hide the kind of knowledge. They would test a little bit on people and so on and themselves, but they would mostly hide most of the information and keep them. So I would like to see this place as becoming the opposite. I would like it to become experimentation platform that is more based on an open knowledge system, where everything that would be produced here would be open knowledge / open source, meaning that you could easily research here, which I think there are being constructed good conditions for research, which I have to compliment, like the residency, the interest into giving artists good opportunities, both into production, but also with money and possibility. But then it also can say makes it possible, or should be possible then, for artists who produce something here to publicize it. And I would highly recommend that everything that is made here is made as open knowledge, as open source. So on the contrary of hiding the information and keeping it secret, then instead of making it completely open. Mostly because I believe that this is how culture is most valuable and most constructive and interesting. But also, maybe you can say that I think here you have a unique situation. You have a public of residents, not so many. They are here alone 7-8 months a year. And then you have a large group of people who all of a sudden come in 3-4 months, which you can also experiment on. So you could look at that group of people as material to experiment with. So I would see myself like being here and experimenting, and then being able to make models, examples that I would publicize. Sometimes even try to go radically into the culture that exists here, both the present and the tourist based, and then see what would come out of that. So this is my immediate response to what I would see this place as. Both because I think that for me the most valuable thing you can get as an artist is an opportunity to research properly in a condition where you actually are able to produce also. Because I believe that the most interesting projects and elements from an artistic practice comes when there's production, when there's something to present, to discuss from. And I believe very much in that you make models, examples, and you try them out. Some of them fail, which is fine. There are still models, examples that maybe can work much better when used by other people. Again, back to not keeping your information, but more bringing that forward for others to use it in a better way. So this is my recommendation also to the place, mostly because I would like to have that opportunity. And so basically I think that it's quite fascinating that you have this group of people here who the population changes so much during 1 year, which I find interesting as a resource. And actually I'm also a little bit fascinated about the thing when you talk about preservation, that maybe I mentioned a little bit the other day that the public who lives here, the residents, maybe that one should think about preserving those 8 months that they work so hard to have, which is something that we all would want to have, like leisure time, free time to do something else than work as mad horses. Maybe that is maybe the most valuable thing here, those 7-8 months. I don't know how to use it, but you could see it as a capital, as something to work with and to experiment with. There are many other things I can say, but I think most of all I would like to say this is the first time I'm here, but I think that the conditions are really good. This I have to compliment again. It seems that you have a strong interest in all the projects and so on, and this is rare. And also that you want to participate so much. Some artists do not really like that. Others really find it very challenging and beautiful, but it seems that something is going on, and this I also admire. But make it completely open, an open knowledge system. That's my recommendation. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's all.
Will you come and do a residency here, please?
Sure. Yeah.
Good. All right, that's settled.
That's easy. You got to get the tone. You got to get the tone right.
Stay. You have to go back.
Deliver it just right.
But I will bring 2 more, or maybe the families also.
Yeah, it's all over now.
But now we have to concentrate on, September to February. Those 8 months.
Okay.
You can have a
Exactly,
baby.
yeah,
You can have a
exactly.
baby in that time,
Yeah, that's beautiful.
more or less.
Okay, Jorge, you want to be next?
Sure. Well, this is my second time here, and I have to say that it's really amazing to be here. And the panel, the first time I was here, kind of really changed the paradigm for me in terms of my work and the way I think about preservation. And this time too, and so I just want to kind of say a little bit about that. And it seems to me like this morning, we always talk about life, about you get out what you put in, but this morning I've kind of redefined that. That if you're talking about what you can kind of ingest and so on, and what you put in and not, and that to me is really I started thinking about that, and it seems to me there's a kind of essential poverty to preservation that we don't put in very much, so we don't get out very much. There's this notion of experimental culture, is about putting in a lot and then expecting something out of it, but expecting also that what might come out might not be useful. So for me, last year and this year was a kind of moment of really thinking about what is experimental preservation and really begin to explore it and begin to create projects around that. And the project that I've been working on pollution came out of the thinking here of what is that. There's a history just a kind of historic preservation in two words. You go in the 19th century from preserving buildings, and then there's something that happens in the 60s where people say, well, we can't do objects anymore, that's too, bourgeois, so we have to break the boundary between spectator and object in the building and how we construct it. So there was this notion of immersive preservation that came up, where you actually, instead of working on buildings, you actually built buildings. This was the Danish experiment, the Plymouth Foundation in the United States. So you actually dressed up in period, and it was this kind of performance theater. It was kind of half scripted. People would show up, you would talk to them, and there was a lot of connections that happened with the world of art at that moment to kind of rethink how you experience history. But the idea was this kind of wide experience, that you immersed yourself in the world of a kind of historical experience. So it was a very theatrical kind of paradigm. And part of what has happened to me in discussing with all of you over the weekend was to discover a kind of new paradigm for thinking about the operations of preservation. And I was talking to Florian and to his team. Tony, is he still here? Oh, there you are. Or not, your collaboration with him and Russell. We had some really interesting conversations too. And we started thinking about, the notion of isolation, that we really, what if you begin to take each of the senses and begin to think about what is preservation of, one of the senses. So the sense of sound, for instance, how would you make a preservation based on just the notion of sound? So this notion of taking from the world of music, the methodology of isolation, and then which your work, I'm trying to speak about what's going to happen later on tonight, this notion of isolation and intensification. And it seems to me that preservation is really all about that it's all about isolation and intensification, except that we have been isolating and intensifying on various paradigms, on kind of visual paradigms, on kind of, urban paradigms, if we do historic districts of neighborhoods and so on. But what if one were to do a kind of isolation of the senses and intensification, then what are the kinds of questions that come up? Well, one of the things is, of course, when we think about sound, is that it's artificial. There's no way to actually do a kind of an authentic preservation. There has to be a kind of constructedness to it, and you can only get to the authentic through a kind of deep artificiality. And that is really an experimental moment where a lot of creativity has to come in, and it's a very projective act. So fantasy, which we were talking about with François, is a way of discovering reality in this case. Fantasy is a way of kind of projecting and trying to discover the real. And then when the real actually appears, you recognize it as such, but because you've been kind of fantasizing about it. So we were talking about if we were to do preservation based on sound, you would actually have to tell somebody you're going to walk into the Taj Mahal, and then you actually begin to fantasize about it, and you would begin to receive it. And this for me is really, but I don't know what will happen to this, but it's really an opening up for me that is very exciting of how one can make experimental work within preservation. And I really look forward to hopefully working with you guys on trying to preserve Yankee Stadium, because Yankee Stadium is the being torn down to build a new one right next to it. And this is the heart of New York City mass culture. So, but now mass culture is much bigger, and the seats are wider because Americans have gotten much fatter. So we couldn't, we had to fit much more people, and so they had to build a whole new stadium to account for the fatness of people. And so we have to, we have to kind of we are losing this stadium. So, what better way to preserve a stadium than through the sound it makes? So, now what kind of experimental preservation? I guess we'll produce some kind of knowledge out of it. I don't know what that will be, but I'm very excited about working on that. And then we were just briefly talking about, how do we disseminate this knowledge? That's really easier said than done, because I tell you, a lot of the experimental preservation work that we've been thinking about here will not find an audience within preservation. And so the task of explaining this to a preservation audience will be extraordinarily difficult if we are really, hoping that it will hit the ground or have some traction. I mean, otherwise it just will, fail because there will be no communication. So that is something that I think is a huge opportunity in this monastery to do. I really agree that this is the preservation campaign here should be an experimental preservation campaign. That it should be about thinking about these. I saw you taking samplings of the well today, sound samplings. I mean, that to me is the beginning of a kind of experimental preservation work. And that it should be about isolating this, of course, like the monks, you were creating a kind of new isolation. And then intensification, the preservation work should do that. And I feel like it's not getting enough attention. It's not intense enough. And that and as a result, it's decaffeinating as opposed to intensifying. If we're talking about substances and brewing and so on, so that's just I'm very excited to be here again and to have just had the luxury of talking to everybody here. So I look forward to staying in touch. So. And more food.
Okay, great. So, yeah. You ready to run?
Yeah, I've come up with the story. I figured that's what we had to keep doing. So actually I wanted to sort of run through a series of stories. And the first one is about a man called William Beckford. One of the things that I do, not everything I do is about the kind of stuff we talked about in this morning's panel. I've sort of done a lot of research into 18th and early 19th century British history, which, for those of you who know that period, you'll know that the ruin features really, really centrally and critically in most people's interests within the arts, right? But William Beckford was a kind of interesting guy who inherited a huge amount of money that was from a plantation, and at the same time was caught in a scandal with the young son of another aristocratic family, and as a result of this had to essentially retire from society. So what he did was to build himself this ridiculously big house that had, which was called Fonthill Abbey, that had a tower in it that was something like 270 feet high, and the transept of this cross-shaped house was the same length. And he turned it into a spectacle. So while it was under construction, what he did was he was very smart about how he turned it into a spectacle. He built a very, very high fence around the property and then had the builders work at night with huge numbers of torches lighting up the scaffolding so that everyone wanted to see in. And so what people would do was would put ladders up against the wall and get up on top of the wall to see the spectacle of this house being built. When it was completed, not that long afterwards, the tower fell down in a storm because the contractor, typical story, had been trying to cheat on the materials in order to make a bigger profit. And he hadn't done the foundation properly. So the first big storm that came along blew it down. And there were people who wrote about this at the time, like people actually travelled to see this site. And there was one particular person who wrote at the time that there was nothing so melancholic as a modern ruin. And there was this idea of the modern ruin as something that was really, really fascinating to people. And this is 1820s, right? And so I thought that it was significant, and significant in a sense it's productive for us to learn today that Matthew's interest in the pavilion the Morning Line Pavilion was that it was somehow being built as a ruin. And so the second story actually has to do with the person I was actually researching on at the time, was just John Soane, and the house that he built for himself in London in Nicholson Fields, which some of you may know. And he did a bunch of drawings of his projects as ruins, including the house, which was something that, you know, he wasn't the only one to have done. A few people did this at the time. And he also wrote a story about his house while it was under construction that fictionalizes it as he, instead of being the architect, is an antiquarian coming across the site and trying to decode what this building was. And Piranesi gets invoked, and an idea of Vestal virgins being entombed in the basement. You know, there's also the idea of a magician's lair, and all sorts of really interesting things that sort of read into this again modern ruin. But the flip side of this is that it's quite likely that one of the reasons that they were painting or drawing these buildings as ruins was that they didn't have axonometrics and cutaway sections yet, right? The techniques of drawings hadn't quite got to that advanced stage, and sections, which they did know how to do, didn't show enough information. So the ruin drawing did two things simultaneously. It showed the building in the future under a state of decay, and it also showed the building under construction. And you could never resolve which of the two things it was, which makes it kind of interesting and slippery. So there was this double interest there. How do you sort of actually talk about the kinds of spatiality you're creating here? How do you talk about the construction techniques, which Soane was very interested in pushing? And at the same time, there was also this strong belief that buildings decayed. They did not see them as permanent monuments. They actually embraced the concept of decay, and they actually used to talk about designing their buildings for the state of ruination. They wanted them to produce noble ruins, right? And their interest in the kind of Roman, Greek, and Gothic ruins that they got to see was that they were alive for them because they were still in the process of decay. It was a temporal process they were just catching a moment of. And one of the only projects I know that allows this to happen is the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, where I happen to live now, which is a very...
Actually in the penitentiary?
No. God, I wish I did, though. It's pretty cool. Which some of you will know from the film 12 Monkeys, if you haven't actually been to it. And it is, in fact, it's not preserved. It's just a site. It's a site that's kept as a site, but they're actively allowing it to continue to deteriorate, although they're not going to use it as a film set because that speeds it up a bit too much. One of the things that I was interested in was first of all, the difference between antiquarianism and archaeology, and I think it's an important one to bring up because Soane was a member of the Society of Antiquaries. His best friend was a man called John Britton, who collaborated with the elder Pugin, before Augustus Pugin came along, and they wrote the first archaeological treatise or set of books, but it's to do with the antiquities of Great Britain. Now, Britain also worked as a showman and wrote a fictional description of the Gothic basement that Soane built in his house as if it really was a serious Gothic shrine. And for all of these guys, antiquarianism, the difference between antiquarianism and archaeology was that antiquarianism allowed the stones to speak, as it were, through the idea of fiction, of mood, of dramatic effects, and all sorts of other things, as well as of history. And they weren't exclusive, and it was fine for history and fiction to coincide in the same object for them. Archaeology erases a lot of that and starts to talk about these things as a science. Right. And what's interesting is that when I was in London doing this research, at the time there was a sort of huge debate about what the National Trust were doing with monuments that they were finding. And in fact, what they were doing with a lot of them was, I think a good example would be, like, say, this wall. They would come across one of these sites to preserve it. They would literally dismantle it completely, stone by stone, label it all, clean every stone, and put it back together again with new mortar. And that's the state of preservation. They would take off all the weeds, everything. And so in a sense, what they were putting back wasn't the original thing. It was a reconstruction of it in a very strange kind of way, right? And so there was this big debate starting at the time about whether or not that was the right thing to do, right? Because and the reason for getting there is to get to the Disneyfication issue, right? Because you already have a souvenir of the thing at this moment in time, even if it's the original stones, right? the other story I wanted to bring up was Ada Flows, because I think we have to, seeing that this thing was called MonuMENTAL, who made the very famous statement that architecture resided in the monument or the tomb, and everything else was building, right? And I was thinking that in that sense, we could probably argue that the pavilion, quote unquote, is probably one of the few acts of real architecture that exist in those terms. But that this project is already like not that, right? Because of your declaration that this is going to be a house and it's going to function in all sorts of other ways. So this is already not that kind of a project, even though it might house some of those projects. You know, sort of roving on a little bit further, I then wrote down, because you know, Mark mentioned the word toxicity, and I've actually written down here MW. You know. And I was thinking that what he meant was feedback, right? In the sort of the language of the kinds of things that Francois was interested in and the previous panel was interested in. It's a kind of feedback as contamination, and it's an important one to put on the table. This is a slightly different story, but that's because a lot of the work that's been done under the name of complexity in architecture has, in my view, tended to work with closed systems. Now, a complex system is, in fact, a whole bunch of open systems and feedback and communication with each other, right? So I think that that's really helpful for us because a closed system, for me, would be also a museumified system, right? And so there's museumified as in, that's one way of looking at this idea of this thing, which is the wall that's cleaned, rebuilt, and then preserved. That's it, right? So in that sense, I thought that you could sort of start to talk about the distinction between that kind of Disneyfication of the old town of Dubrovnik and the construction or use or, I guess, double process of construction and restoration as a kind of practice that this particular project has to, by definition, have because of the client's needs. I thought you could sort of argue that what you've got here is a dialogue between the modern ruin and the old ruin, right? And it's a dialogue that's happening at multiple levels. The monastery that is then turned into something like a contemporary house, right, and research laboratory, and also the presence of these new pavilion projects in friction with the historical sites. And I think that that's really very interesting. And so that would be a very different model of preservation. It's not even just an experimental preservation, it's doing something quite different. And I think that one of the things that this, now to slide out of the stories back into the sort of problematic that I think Francesca wanted to ask, you know, I've got like one line of text left, was to say that you know, when you were talking about preservation earlier in the conversation, I can't remember which day it was now. They're all kind of blurred. I was thinking that one of the things that you were interested in preserving, that your interest in preservation here wasn't just about the monuments, about the sites that exist. It was actually to do with the preservation of a kind of vitality and viability of the entire community, of the entire island, and that's a very different kind of a project in which these things are operative, but they're not the sole endeavour. And in that sense, one of the things that, because you were talking about, one of the issues here is for you to figure out ways to talk to the community about how to get permissions. And it seems to me that it would be seriously in their interest, because what you're doing here is developing a model for a very different kind of tourism. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, you know, I mean, we can sort of theorise all of these things, but what's actually important is that by bringing in these contemporary projects alongside these historical projects, you will be creating a model of tourism that's not about the cruise ship that turns up with 5,000 visitors every day, but turns up with a different community of people who come here for different reasons, who probably will invest in the place in a different way, and actually probably will spend more money, which for the community is another way of making it viable. Okay. That's me done.
Okay. As you probably remember from the first panel at which I participated, I'm not natural-born panelist, but I will share some of my impressions and experiences with you. So let's share, everyone. Yeah? Also, what makes it even more challenging is that I am neither architect nor artist. I used to be physicist, and after some zigzagging in my professional life, I eventually become UNDP, United Nations Development Program clerk. So it's really cultural challenge to talk to you. So it's my first time here, and how it happened is that, as Francesca explained before, a friend of mine, which happened to be a friend of her, thought that it's a good idea, that it has something in common with what I do professionally, and I agree. I heard a lot of things here which are interesting and which are in line with nature preservation, and sustainable development, which is focus of what we are working on at the moment. But beyond that, I really enjoyed being exposed to even to these panels because
You mean
because
even?
no, it was no.
Thanks.
Sometimes it become a little bit too challenging, but for me it was like traveling on I mean, maybe it will sound pathetic, but like traveling on another planet, like 2-day trip, because discourse that you use is not what people on the beach are using, and so it was very interesting and quite enjoyable, and I as I shared yesterday with someone during the dinner, it kind of softened me. I think that I will use experience from here, this postmodern world, there is no one truth, everything goes, and let's hear what other people think. This is not how it functions at the project. At the project, something has to be done and blah blah. So it's too hard too stiff in a way. So I will try to use it. But okay, let's go back to my notes here. That I try to prepare a statement when you explained us that each of us will prepare a statement. So I liked what you said about 7-8 months as a capital worth preserving, and we are talking about preservation, and I would add developing or filling with something, and this something can be cultivated nothing, but not boredom, because then people start abusing drugs, which is not good. Although using it can be science and interesting and everything, yeah. Experimental, yeah, sure. I mean, worldview widening, yeah. We were talking. It was written here that we will talk something about future and the past, how it relates to each other of Lopud. And I checked even what the article from the previous that documented previous discussion, which was about preservation and quite theoretical, and not being a professor of preservation as two of you I think happen to be, or something like that.
No.
It's okay.
This one, yes.
It's our dream.
It's your dream, okay, yeah. But okay, it seems to me, as to lay person, as obvious that preservation of stone is not possible as fixation of it in a time is not possible, because there is a life, and life will always prevail. And so we can only shape this life in a way, or direct it, or do something with it. So instead of preserving stones, it seems to me better to use island as infrastructure for experiences worth experiencing. Yeah. This said, I'm getting closer to end of this short statement. I'm dealing with nature preservation, and you mentioned toxicity, and we were talking about this toxic garden, and toxicity as a term appeared. one of the basic truths of environment protection is that there is no such toxic thing for nature as too many nature lovers at one place in unorganized and unorganized way. So in order to make them somehow more nature friendly and still to allow them to enjoy nature that they love so much and that attract them, because that's the reason why they visit islands such as Lopud, we need some superstructure, so to say, and this is what Francois called social protocols, if I understood it correctly, or operating instructions, or this kind of things, stories. Basically, you need story. It's not only stone, but you need story around that stone. Or you need people with initiative, so-called gurus of old ways, gurus that can lead people to this kind of experiences. And this Renaissance Garden the project that was presented yesterday, seemed to me as a great kind of focal point for wider activity, wider initiative, which is network of paths all over island, also dealing with autochthonous species, which can be medical, can be toxic, can be aromatic plants, basically, which can, in a way, structure visitors' presence in this to add something to visiting this island above shrimps on the beach, or which is also very good, but add something more. This can also be, because this happened in the spring, I don't know if you have opportunity to walk up the hill, but it's beautiful, it's smell, it's overwhelming. So this is something that can fill this one of these 7-8 months with a quality time, quality experience. And I think that would be all that I wanted to share. Yeah, there is no big ending, sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And hostess.
Okay, thank you. Oh God, I hate to go last.
All right.
We went first. Or first. Well, you mentioned being a layperson in this company, and I also myself feel very, very intimidated by many of the things that are said here, because I can't articulate myself at all in this brilliant way. And no, I can't. I'm trying to learn. I made all these notes that I know are going to make me sound much more clever than I really am. And I just know that there's a way of putting sentences together that can really fool people. But anyway, I'm going to try.
Now, what do you mean by that?
Oh, what did I write here? Well, no, I think that understanding realities in a conservation initiative, and I wouldn't call this a project because it's a series of initiatives. I mean, and they also did start rather long ago, sort of in 1992, when I first discovered this cache of about 20 Renaissance paintings that were panel paintings, and they were all sort of stashed in a terrible hurry in the basement of a palace in Dubrovnik during the war. It was sometime in January, December, and Dubrovnik's very, very damp in the winter, and there's just condensation and water sort of pouring down the surfaces of these paintings. And you know, it was just as an instant gut reaction. I've got to restore these, and I had no clue how to do it. I had never been to. I traveled to New York and lived in the studio house of Marco Grassi, who was at the time the restorer of the Thyssen collection in Lugano, was the only person I knew. And he says, "Oh, you can follow some lectures at NYU." And you know, so I attended class as an outsider at NYU at the Institute of Fine Art and studied a little bit about conservation for about 3 months. And on the basis of that tiny little bit of knowledge, I started the Arch Foundation, which for the last 15 years has been doing conservation and restoration projects, from these beautiful paintings in Dubrovnik to another project when I got involved in Marrakesh, in the Medina of Marrakesh. And one of the first projects we did there is we restored a fountain that was just a really grimy, horrible, and it would, you know, had an old, beautiful, you know, this carved wood, Islamic carved wood sort of part, and we took that and it was all beautifully restored, got all the tack, cleaned up all the piping, brought new piping, replumbed the whole thing. And it was amazing. We put a tiny little plaque there saying Arch Foundation did this. And I came back a year later, and instead of all the people in the local community sort of being really all cheerful, that the local government had fenced off that fountain because it had been so wonderfully restored that they didn't want anybody to destroy it, and so nobody was allowed to use it, and everybody from that street had to then walk like 1.5 kilometers to go and get their water at the next fountain. They hated me because they thought I had done that. So I really sort of like started to realize that the conservation, preservation of things can actually ruin them forever, and that reversibility is a key word. So with my experience of doing these projects a little bit all over the place, I learned a few lessons, and primarily because I had a privilege of working with some amazing people that taught me everything that they could, and I could absorb. And a very similar thing happened in contemporary art to me, because I sort of dove into this about 6 years ago. And I don't consider myself a collector in the traditional sense of the words at all. Not like my father had collected paintings. He had a pinakothek, which is a wonderful old word hardly anybody uses anymore, for his collection. And when people started to say, "Oh, you're a collector," I felt totally uncomfortable, because I was already beginning to feel the burden and responsibility of looking after a few hundred works of art. And then we've been collecting very complicated and difficult works of art, not only to store, but to maintain and to install and to show and to lend, and God knows. So our foundation, preserve, I mentioned, it was a nightmare to preserve them. And so, you know, from our office of 6 women, I might add, we've grown into a huge production office, really, with these projects, and combining all these different disciplines has been a real... We've had a few growing pains. It's not been easy because there's been so much innovation that we've had to learn. And looking at Daniela over here, help me here. But I think... What I didn't know, or what can't be detected up front in a conservation project, because years ago, one of the first people I brought here, funnily enough, was Frank Gehry, because at the time I was restoring the synagogue in Dubrovnik, and I met him in Vienna. He was giving a lecture, and I mentioned I was going down to Dubrovnik, and he said, "Oh," I was there with his wife, and he came down. And this was a complete ruin. All the roofs were missing, and everything was open to the sky. And I said, "You know, I really don't know what to do with this place." And he said to me, "You know, then don't do anything. And you know what? Just come and spend time here, and eventually, over the years." Which has turned out to be so true. Over the years, you will begin to understand what this place really needs. And I'm so glad that, in a way, I haven't been impatient, because when there have been errors, and there have been errors, and there have been terrible, bad advice, and you know, people with terrible agendas of their own, and dealing with egos and people just forcing things through and over you because they, you know, it's like you feel raped half the time, to be honest. And it's been really difficult defending my position and knowing what to do and having all the answers sometimes. And I really want to thank my team, Vesna, for being so patient with me. and Igor and Katerina, because they sit in Dubrovnik, which is no fun in the winter, trust me. And it's like getting them out of hibernation is always a joy, and bringing them out to Lopud for the May sessions and bringing this place back to life is very important to all of us, because and you all coming here and sharing all that knowledge and us trying to absorb so much of it at the same time, it's sometimes very difficult. But what I'm taking with me is the encouragement that I got from you last year. And I hope that since last year that there has been, when we came here when we first installed Olafur's Pavilion, and I went up there today and the garden is looking, the landscaping that I did last year just worked. I thought, oh, maybe I'm a landscape gardener after all, or maybe I think I'm an architect because, I could, and then actually, Ben, you said to me, you are an architect, because architects are architects of ideas and of projects and of, it's not just all about buildings, is it? It's just a combination of bringing things together. Sort of said, nobody touches this monastery until we've really got a better plan. Nobody's going to do any more restoration here until there are better people that really care about this building and not who just see it as another job to skim a bit and get a bit of extra money from. And I think patience, and like Frank Gehry said, take your time and the right thing will happen and the right people will come to you. And I believe in that. And the second part of that, so in the meantime, let's just keep using it like this. It's rather nice to sit in this empty room and get a bit cold in the evening, but there's space and there's places to do all sorts of different things and interventions. Using the cloister this morning was great for me. And you'll see our barbecue. We've now done this barbecue a few times and we've got it down to a T. So, but the second thing about it is generosity, and maybe I'm happy that the generosity that I wanted to extend to everybody here is deeply felt and enjoyed. And I really hope that you understand how much I appreciate your generosity, because you've all been extremely generous and shared amazing ideas and knowledge without a fee, and not one of you have actually asked for one this time. And I think I just want to mention this. No, because actually I'm getting really embarrassed about this, and I think, well, and then people ask for different fees, and then it all gets really complicated. So thank you for that. I appreciate that, because I think we all go home with something else than a fee, and it probably means a bit more than $500 or whatever. You know what I mean? And so I think that sense of generosity is very mutual and very much shared. And the third thing is about this continuity of exploration and experimentation. And I think I said this rather cynically the first day I was here, but for those who missed it, I came back here this May and I checked into my little La Villa and strolled out in the afternoon, and it was nice and quiet, and it was Lopud as it always is, and nothing here ever seems to change. And so there's this, I think when you do experiments in a laboratory, you've got this constant environment with which you can then explore the results of your experiment. So the tranquility and the predictability of this island somehow is a very good place to do this experimentation. So I'd like to invite all of you back to continue to come back, and any time you want to conduct any experiment for whatever it is, you may do so. And some people have come back on honeymoons and they've tried to experiment with marriage. So so we've got 3 honeymoon couples at the villa at the moment. So that's it from me, and really want to thank you for everything, for being here and for coming back. For those of you that have come back, I think this is a good sign. This is a really good sign. So, thank you.
I feel like I'm all for happy endings, but
No more broken leaves.
no more talk. This is the idea. The idea is to move to food, but I guess in a way we want to ask your permission to do that, because if there are any of you who want to say something, that we feel like you should be able to say it.
Russell.
But our general feeling is to hit the food.
I'd like Russell to say something, please.
Thanks for letting me come back again. I hope we get to do a panel again very, very soon. Please let's make a Let's Panel t-shirt.
Yeah, we're doing a let's.
And next time we have some panels, please pass by some of us the possibility of finding out who else possibly could be there as well.
What you mean, invite and then have a, yeah.
Because I don't know, maybe for
Yeah.
example from the toxicity thing this morning there was
Yeah.
like, oh shit, that guy or whoever, that mutant should be here, or you know, because there's so many more freaks for the broth.
Yeah.
Really.
More freaks for the broth. But I like the fact that there have been a lot of architecture freaks here on this time.
For
I
sure.
sat at dinner with 10 architects the other night and I survived.
Yeah, actually, in defence of the...
Poured concrete.
Yeah, he wants concrete. But I think in defence of the Architects Union, I mean, I think it would be also nice to thank Francois for the project, because no matter what the
It's a stimulus.
the future of the project is, it was really very efficient surgically in unleashing discussion. I mean, I agree that we had enough already, but it was a project that had the capacity to release discussion. And in a way, this goes immediately to the open source thing, because I think the open source actually requires the closure to make it possible. I mean, again, the monastery, the closure, the isolation you talk about. And I think the project somehow was quite lethal in exposing some of the potentials of this building and its future. So I think, for us in the architects team, we feel like one of our best weapons was put to good use here with this guy.
With these guys. Yay!
So maybe Stephanie and Francois should give the last word.
Yeah, Francois and Stephanie, please, both of you, because your project is just so amazing. It's opened up everybody's imagination.
I'd like to hear this partner speak.
No, it's very difficult when people flatter me. I don't know where to go, like a little mouse in the little hole somewhere. So I think now we have together. It's very interesting. We have together to develop a strategy. We have a design. We have a protocol, a beginning of a protocol of a design as a potential, and we know that if we are directly with this project in the public space as it is, immediately it will produce the suicide of the project. So we have also, as soon as possible, you need to help me to define the strategy. If we want to produce it really, with several steps of efficiency and several steps also of scenario. We have to, a bit, not to be tricky, but a little bit to scenarize the scenario with several layers, where we could infiltrate the kind of resistance this kind of project could produce. And I know because many of our projects reveal a situation and in the same time immediately provoke a kind of aggressivity. We arrive at the middle of my career, something like that. So now we are very interesting to cross really this line of reality. And you need to help me. I cannot do it alone.
No, Francesca, I really want to tell you thank you, because sometimes since we work with Francois since a long time now, so sometimes it's like your work makes sense, and for me it's very important, this kind of discussion and this kind of sharing, because it makes sense, and it's exactly for me the exact attitude to grow up. So.
So it seems to me we end with the most eloquent comment, and that is the end.
That is the end, yes.